Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐡 𝐅𝐸𝐬𝐲. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. You can call me the ominous 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐡. Now, Elon Musk has hit the news once again recently because he has very recently bought Twitter. So this dude is clearly ambitious. He's clearly intelligent. He is the very definition of somebody who thinks outside the box. But he also has Asperger's syndrome. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about what Asperger's syndrome is. Obviously, as a psychiatrist, I'm very aware that it's no longer a formal diagnosis. It's been removed from the latest version of the DSM, DSM-5, and also the same for the ICD-11. But I'm going to call it Asperger's because that's what Elon himself calls it. And also because for people that suffers from this disorder, whatever you call it, Asperger's previously, autistic spectrum disorder now, their symptoms and their kind of restrictions haven't suddenly disappeared because some fuddy-duddy psychiatrists decide to call it something different. So to me, it's still valid. Or I would say that from my clinical experience, I've assessed hundreds of people with this diagnosis. Also in this video, I'm going to talk about how this diagnosis or this condition might have affected Elon Musk himself, especially in his childhood, and how it shaped him as a person and a genius and somebody who is so successful. And then finally, schminally, I'm going to talk at the end about stigma and discrimination for Asperger's and bit of a contentious issue, why I think there's an issue with it being overdiagnosed. Let's get started. Sit back, relax, and welcome to A Psych for Small Minds. Okay, let's start with the basics. I'm going to define what autistic spectrum disorder is and then how Asperger's is different. So, I'm sure you've heard the term, and you might know that it has two key areas. So it's issues with social interactions and communications, and also kind of restricted ideas and repetitive kind of behaviors and interests as well. So the first bit, social interactions, people with autistic spectrum disorder, they can't necessarily understand the intentions or even the facial expressions of other people. So they don't know if somebody's flirting with them, if they're peeing somebody off, if they're getting angry with them. They don't understand if somebody enjoys their company necessarily, if they're happy or not. So they really struggle to understand the vibe they're getting off other people. They also understand that they also struggle sometimes to maintain conversation. So they might jump in at inappropriate times. They may not ask anybody else questions about themselves. They might go off on tangents. They just don't fit in. They're kind of slightly socially awkward. The other thing is that sometimes they take things literally. So if you use the phrase like, I know that person's gunning for you, then somebody with Asperger's or autism might actually think literally that he has got a gun and he's going to hurt you. Or if you say, don't blow smoke up my ass, they might interpret this as actually literally some sort of carcinogenic anal activity. And the other thing is there's restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. So they get passionately, obsessively into a couple of different interests and they really like some sort of routine. And if that routine breaks, especially somebody with severe autism, it can lead to extreme agitation and anger. In terms of repetitive movements, it might be something like rocking or banging or kind of tapping. So they find sort of a soothing comfort in this kind of repetitive movement. So Asperger's is kind of all of those things, but it's thought of as a mild end of autistic spectrum disorder. There's less language problems and there's less cognitive decline. And something else that I think gets forgotten about is that Asperger's often only gets diagnosed in adulthood rather than childhood and adolescence versus autism, because the changes or the differences are so subtle that you don't really notice them when somebody's sort of changing throughout adolescence. It's only when you spend more time, I guess, having cerebral conversations like in adulthood that it becomes clear. All right, so that's all the background. That's enough of the foreplay. Let's get into it. How is Elon Musk? What kind of features of Asperger's does he have? Well, first of all, he's completely admitted this himself. He said it during a recent Saturday Night Live gig. He said it in interviews. He says that he's not particularly confident. He doesn't like sort of speaking. I've seen him in a recent TED Talk interview where he certainly made poor eye contact. So he was kind of staring off into the distance, not really looking at the interviewer. He was going off on tangents. You can tell by the intonation of his voice that it doesn't sort of vary. And I think this is a really important point that I'd like you to take home, my schmike guys and gals. Just because these things are hard for somebody with this kind of condition doesn't mean they can't do it. So the very fact that someone like Elon Musk was brave enough to go onto Saturday Night Live, make jokes, be in sketches, put himself on a pedestal where he himself could be mocked, I think really speaks to his kind of attitude and personality. So I guess what I'm trying to say is just because somebody with any kind of disorder, whether it's Asperger's, whether it's any kind of mental health issue, illness, just because it makes things harder doesn't mean they're impossible. Yeah, so I think that people can be more. You shouldn't make the assumption that you can't be successful with these kind of conditions. Having said all that, I do think that possibly his Asperger's has led him afoul at some point. So he might have missed some social cues. He might have had some poor judgment. For example, he had like a brief Twitter spat with one of the Thai boy rescuers, and called him the P word. Elon called him the P word, which I think was a really poor judgment, especially somebody as successful and as rich and as popular as Elon. He doesn't have to stoop to those lows. He called him the P word. I'm not going to say it, but it rhymes with 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐝. So yeah, I suppose now that he owns Twitter, he could just kick that guy off anyway. So there are obviously other high achievers that have this diagnosis or are suspected of having this diagnosis. Can you tell me who they are? That's right. One of them will be my boy Albert Einstein. You'll know him from the theory of relativity and also from the wild crazy hair. He made it cool way before Boris Johnson. And another sufferer of Asperger's who's very successful would be my man Steve Jobs, RIP, and RIP to Albert, who obviously invented Apple, and he made high-waisted pants cool way before Simon Cowell. Okay, let's get into what I think is probably the most interesting part of this episode. How has Asperger's shaped Elon Musk as a person? So in interviews, in particular this TED Talk one that I talked about, Elon said that his childhood was quite unhappy, that he was quite harshly bullied by other kids. And that's actually very kind of common, because I suppose kids aren't mature enough or they don't care enough to understand that somebody has a condition. When you're that young, they're like a pack of wolves and they just kind of prey on anybody who's different. And somebody who's got Asperger's may not have the confidence, they might not fit in, they might not be popular, they might not get the joke. So people end up making the joke about them. They don't have the witty banter that school kids may or may not have. So, and the other thing I'd say is that people with severe autism often go to like special schooling because they have such obvious high needs. And sometimes as adults, they're kept in care homes. But with Asperger's, it's actually very unlikely, because the changes are so subtle that nobody realizes necessarily they're different till they're adults, as I said, or they're still able to function at such a high level that it doesn't kind of warrant the extra resources of taking them to a special school. So back to Elon, he himself acknowledges that because of this, he was kind of marginalized. He didn't really have any friends. So what did he do? He spent his time reading books, and then he got into coding. And he said that he got kind of obsessed with coding. He'd literally stay up all night sometimes writing and learning new code. And I think this could be related to his Asperger's. So as I said before, it is associated with like restrictive, repetitive interests and movements. So he really got into it. He got obsessed. And we cannot overlook the fact that he's highly intelligent. So because of all these traits, I think they kind of helped him in a way. So indirectly, having Asperger's meant he was bullied, so he's kind of pushed away, marginalized, more time for him to get obsessed into sort of logic and solving problems. That's indirectly. And directly, once he got there, his kind of restricted, repetitive nature made him obsess over this problem. So there's two different mechanisms. So I think you could even argue that if he wasn't bullied and marginalized, if people were friendlier to Elon, maybe we wouldn't have this genius that we had. Maybe he wouldn't have been pushed into becoming what he became. Maybe we wouldn't have Teslas, etc., etc. And the other thing I'd say is that it sounds like he thought of the world differently. So he looked at the world more logically, which is typical in Asperger's. So whilst other teenagers were thinking about, how do I fit in? How do I get more friends? How do I get more popular? Why doesn't this girl fancy me? They think emotionally. I think Elon thought logically, a bit more like sort of, Dr. Spock, a computer. He thought about problems. This is a problem that the world has. How can I solve it? Which is kind of altruistic when you think about it. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little bit about the stigma of people with Asperger's and the assumption. As the famous saying goes, if you are son, you make an ass out of you and your mum. As I think I pointed out, there are a lot of successful people who have Asperger's, very successful people actually. You've got my boy Elon Musk, you've got Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs. And I think it's good that you have people like this, especially nowadays in the world of social media, because I think they need representation. There is a push for representation for women, for people from ethnic backgrounds, and that's all good. But I think it's important for people with mental health conditions to have representation, which is why I'm a fan of Elon. Final point is, I think there's a danger in over-diagnosing Asperger's to a degree, but I'd say more autism. I've done a separate videos on this, always be plugging, and I will put the links in the section below. But basically, I think there's a huge push to diagnose kids who might have some of the features but not the diagnosis. So for example, a shy kid or a kid who's not interacting particularly well with in school or nursery, there's this kind of pressure on clinicians such as myself to diagnose autism or Asperger's. I can kind of understand why parents do it, because they're concerned about their kids, they want like an explanation, they want some sort of treatment. But the problem is, if you appropriate these conditions when lots of people don't actually have them, then you're thinning out the resources. So the parents of children who need high level of support, who need like special educational needs in school, or even for their kids to have carers or to be put into these like specialist establishment, it muddies the waters and it clouds those resources if too many people are trying to get that. It makes it harder for the people at the severe end who need it to get it. So that is my problem with this whole situation. Anyway, I've rambled on enough. In conclusion, what did we learn from this episode? We learnt what Asperger's is. Even though it's not technically a disorder, you kind of understand how it fits into the autistic spectrum disorder. We talked about Elon Musk specifically, about how it directly and indirectly affected his childhood and turned him into the person he is, shaped him as a genius. We learned a little bit about the stigma and the discrimination that people with Asperger's face and the problems with overdiagnosing it. I've said enough. Buy my goddamn book. Subscribe to my channel. I need more subscribers because I wasn't hugged enough as a kid and I'm really insecure. Have a blessed day, and do not forget, I love you.